Welcome to the Asia Chessboard, the podcast that examines geopolitical dynamics in Asia and takes an inside look at the making of grand strategy. I'm Mike Green of the United States Studies Center in Sydney and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome back to the Asia Chessboard. I'm Mike Green. I'm joined by an old friend and a leading strategic thinker from Korea, Dr. Choi Kang, who is president of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Seoul. He's led as Dean of Planning and Assessment at the KNDA, Korean National Diplomatic Academy, was president of IFANS, Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security, and he's been advising governments and has participated in government negotiations, including the four-party talks in the 1990s. Great to have you with us. Looking forward to it.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Green. So I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon.
So people who follow North Asia or international affairs should know the Asan Institute. It's an independent think tank in Seoul that does some of the most influential strategic analysis and especially public opinion polling. And you guys came out with your annual poll recently, South Koreans and their neighbors. And I thought what we might do is go through some of the results of what Koreans are thinking about the world and use that as our way to talk about some of the strategic developments. But I want to start with you, Choi. Mm-hmm. How did you get into this? Did your parents hope that you would be a dentist or a doctor and you took a wrong turn? Or how did you go down this route?
I'm a descendant of the family came from North Korea. My father, actually, his hometown in North Korea. So he was much dedicated to this North Korean affairs, and he wants me to become a person who is directly or indirectly involved in these affairs, very much emphasize on national security issues. So that's why I started works in this field maybe about 50 years ago.
And your PhD, where did you do it?
Yeah, PhD, I got that from the Ohio State University and specialized in arms control during the Cold War era. But actually, since I joined the KIDA, the Korean Institute for Defense Analysis in 1992, I started as an analyst on the inter-Korean relations, crisis management, multilateral cooperation like this issues all the way. And then I joined the government. Actually, KIDA is established and sponsored by the Ministry of Defense. But one day I got a phone call from my old mentor and then called me and, "Hey, Kang, I want to join the National Security Council." Then I joined National Security Council during the Kim Dae-jung era for 5 years. That actually gave me a great experience working in the government and work with the people I worked with them. Nowadays, they became vice minister of each ministry.
Yeah.
Or also national. Yeah.
And I think this is accurate. You're a bit unique in the Korean world of political or geopolitical expertise in that, Korean politics are quite polarized. Mm-hmm. And have been for decades and decades. You've managed to work with both sides of politics, and they've called on you sometimes to go into government, sometimes to advise them pretty regularly. And I think that gives you a perspective on the evolution of Korean strategic thinking, because you've seen ideas move from party to party, government to government over decades. I was trying to think when I first met you, I think it might have been 1994 or 95. And I was working at IDA. You might have been at KIDA at the time. And as I recall, we did an exercise examining stability in North Korea and how that would affect the U.S.-Korea alliance, which was prepared for breaking the armistice or an attack or an invasion. But instability in North Korea was not something that we were ready for. And I remember it was an uncomfortable conversation because, as you'll recall, Kim Young-sam had made a lot of noise after the death of Kim Jong about going north and liberating. And I was in Washington, and the view in Washington, that made the Clinton administration a bit nervous. And I remember your participation because you moved beyond all that and you pointed out our common strategic interests and how we should think about it. And I think it was very influential. I want to get into the evolution of strategic thinking in Korea, but I think we'll do that by going through the Asan survey. So tell us a bit about the Asan survey. You've been doing surveys at Asan for 20 years, I think, at least.
Actually, we started the survey in 2010, and also we have conducted all the way up to now, except 2017, and also during the COVID-19 era, we were not able to conduct any kinds of poll. But except that, actually, we have managed about 13 polls all the way up to now. In just It is mostly about the foreign and national security issues. We try to maintain the core questions as far as we can, but sometimes we add or delete and modify the questions to reflect the ongoing situation in and around the Korean Peninsula.
So let's go through some of the findings because I'm a consumer of the Asan surveys and have been from the beginning. And to me, they're a leading indicator of where strategic thinking is going in Seoul. And I sometimes think because politics have been quite polarized and confrontational, that these polls kind of show the emerging consensus when politicians may not admit what it is yet. So it's like I've always thought of it as a leading indicator. And this year's poll is really interesting in that context. I'll start with the one that most people are talking about. This is a man bites dog story. It's puzzling, but we'll talk about why. So that's the views on Japan and Takaichi. And you and I have been involved in trilateral exercises.
Yes.
In and out of government. And sometimes they're smooth and sometimes they're not. They can become quite confrontational. But this is really striking. Koreans gave Japan a net positive rating for the first time. But the really striking thing is Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai was rated by Koreans as the most popular leader in the world. And you know her history. She ran for a few years, promising things like visits as Prime Minister of the Yasukuni Shrine. And she was actually quite critical of the diplomacy between Seoul and Tokyo of previous governments. And yet she is now the most respected, or at least most popular world leader in Korea. So, Dr. Choi, what happened?
So that's the one that I have not been able to answer. But actually, it seems to me that there is a China factor. She stood up against China, very straightforward. The South Koreans' feeling toward China has deteriorated over the past at least 5 to 10 years, continuously. So Takaichi-san actually stood against Chinese coercion or coercive diplomacy, and then straightforward. Of course, initially, South Koreans were very concerned about Prime Minister Takaichi's orientation and her feeling toward Korean people and Korean history. But since taking office, she did not make any critical comments on history issues. He primarily focused on the security issues very much. So that's one factor. But we have to go back to prior Takaichi-san's inauguration, actually starting with Yoon Suk-yeol and Kishida. So actually they paved the way toward the improvement of bilateral relations. But actually it seems to me that people are ahead of government. It seems to me that over the years, of course, whenever there's a dispute over history or territorial problems, South Korea responded very negatively toward the Japanese action or Japanese position. But mostly once that's over, South Korea became very friendly toward Japan, especially young people. So this year is record high of Japanese visitors or Korean visitors to the best way. So actually people's understanding, emotion toward each side has improved and matured. That's the first factor. Second, actually, of course, is a kind of regular, Dr. You know this, it's a regular cycle. Actually, in February, we have a Takashima Day. In March, we have the white paper or the textbook guideline, all this. So nowadays become a new normal. We know that actually Japanese government will announce this kind of on what day. Nowadays, it's kind of ritual. Okay, we know that it's coming. We are ready to take it. And then it's over. It's kind of new normal. But actually, I was really surprised when I first got into these kinds of videos. Every February was chaotic between the two countries. But nowadays, it lasts any 1 or 2 days. That's it. But the media coverage has down substantially. So only just 1 or 2 sentences, Japanese government did what, and then actually the other thing, actually, in regard to that, the Takashima Day, this time, Takaichi-san sent a vice minister level person to that Shimane district. So that actually, the Korean people, she is trying to moderate, not to provoke as the South Koreans, but moderating her position on this issue. So that is much appreciated. But as I said, the basic understanding is Korean people has become much mature in their understanding about Japan.
She's like her mentor Abe in that she rose to the top, fueled in part by ideology, and her base on the right, like Abe, but in government is far more pragmatic than ideological. And the structural thing's interesting. We did a survey at the U.S. Studies Center in Australia and CSIS, strategic thinkers in Japan, Australia, and the U.S. And we asked the question, how important is it for Korea and Japan to cooperate on security? And of course, the Americans and Australians 100% said very important.
Mm-hmm.
That's a bipartisan view in the US and in Australia. But we were surprised because close to 90% of the Japanese respondents said it's very important. So you could see on the Japanese side as well, thanks to China, there's a structural convergence. It's maybe too simple to say it, but the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But Korea and Japan have always had overlapping values, alliance with the US. There's always been a basis for this. The other thing I think that accounts for it is when we've had these eruptions in Japan-Korea relations in the past, more often than not, it's provoked or caused by the right wing in Japan or the left wing in Korea. And you can't get much more right wing than Takeichi and maybe not too much more left than Lee Jae-myung. And the funny thing is they seem to like each other.
Yeah.
And they play rock and roll drums. And I've known Takeichi since 1989, by the way. She worked in the U.S. Congress when I worked in the Japanese Diet. I met her then. She's a very likable person. And so it's the old Nixon goes to China effect. You can't outflank Lee Jae-myung very easily on the left or Takeichi on the right. So that probably, I think, accounts for it too. Leaders, we're being very political sciencey, but structure and the Chinese factor, institutional things, and then, of course, leadership. So quite remarkable.
Yeah, actually, you described the President Lee Jae-myung as a left, but actually it seems to me that he is quite pragmatic. I was really surprised. He chose Japan as his first overseas visit before coming. Usually all the Korean presidents came to Washington D.C. first, then maybe Tokyo, then Beijing. But Lee Jae-myung is the first one who came to Tokyo before coming to Washington, D.C. So actually that leads the question is, there is a U.S. factor. We underscore the importance of China factor in forging the relation between the two, Korea and Japan. But actually this time, another factor is the U.S. Can we trust the U.S. administration at the moment? That's why we need to cooperate with each other to bring the same position, common position toward the Trump administration. I think that's another factor contributing to
it. Is. Yeah. Definitely. So what you're saying is Lee Jae-myung is a bit like Abe and Takeichi, runs and rises to power in the left, but governs from the center, or center left in his case, center right for Takeichi. The senior officials they chose told you a lot. Takeichi picked people like Funakoshi as vice foreign minister. The top bureaucrat picked Ichikawa. These, by the way, are very pro-U.S. Japan alliance and pragmatic. And then in Korea, you had my old friend Wee Sung-lak, our mutual friend,
of course, he's
advisor, Foreign Minister Cho and others. Well, we'll turn to the U.S. I think the U.S. is a factor, but I think, tell me what you think, but I think some scholars, analysts, journalists mistake this growing Japan-Korea rapprochement or Japan-Australia or India-Australia, all the rest of it. They think it's as a kind of hedge or replacement for the U.S., but the governments doing it are actually quite pro-alliance with the U.S. And my view of it is the big problem is China. And the U.S. factor is when you do a summit with President Trump, you don't know what you're going to get. It's quite risky. So much better to line up your chickens with people you can trust. And Japan, Korea, India, Australia can all trust each other. So I don't see it personally as a big de-alignment or hedging so much as sequencing. With the powers in your region, you can have a good summit with to shape the field and get ready for Trump, because a Trump summit is it's a poker game. You don't know what you're going to get. That's my take. What do you think?
I agree with you, because actually it's a lineup. And also, but on the other hand, the most recent, actually, the Mr. Trump's position on Ukraine war or the Middle East case actually raised a concern about credibility.
Right.
Of course, it is not really hedging, but actually kind of additional point to make the alliance stronger all the way up to now. Both, I think South Korea and Japan wants to have a trilateral summit, but I don't know whether the Trump administration has same position or not. So actually maybe collaboration between the two, the Korea and Japan, will enhance the possibility of a trilateral summit and reinvigorate a trilateral cooperation amongst these three countries who share the same values like freedom, democracy, and human rights as well. And we have also same common concern. Of course, South Korea does not say much about China factor, but actually we are very much concerned with growing power and coercive behavior of China. So the public sentiment is very geared toward that direction. I don't know. Officials cannot say anything negative on China because they still want to have a good relation with China. But as we can read on Lee Jae-myung's inauguration speech, so it is centered upon the ROK-US alliance, we will approach China. That was his statement. And also his speech at the CSIS about this. It is not feasible to maintain security with the United States economy in China. That is no longer valid or the feasible strategy. So actually, that's why I said, I was really surprised when I heard that, whether he's a leftist or pragmatist. I say, at least at the moment, he's a pragmatist. So he concurs with the common understanding of a centrist or realist in Korea very much. So that's why. So China factor, but still, why we don't say any critical things toward China, but we have a deep concern. That is very well reflected in our the survey.
So the Minjidong, the party of President Lee Jae-myung, has been dominated by the so-called 386 generation, people who are your age and my age, who are in their 30s, in the 80s, and 386. Yeah, 30s, went to school in the 80s, in their 30s, born in the 60s, whatever it is, they're all
born in the 60s.
You need to change the number now. Everyone's in their 60s, but that generation, dominated No Mu-hyun's government, Moon Jae-in's government, and now Lee Jae-myung. I get the sense, though, that generation is a bit disconnected from the younger generation of Koreans. And that in some ways, although they are around Lee Jae-myung, he's listening more to average Koreans than those kind of traditional 386 people in this party, it seems.
I had a chance to talk with some senior officials in the current administration.
Yeah.
They are much concerned with the public opinion, very much. Not, as you said, so what is the result of public poll? So actually, he's very much concerned with public understanding and public response rather than the people around him. So it seems to me that he dominates the people around him. His public approval rate is more than 67% nowadays, approaching 70%. Maybe the highest record in the same period compared to with other the president. So he's quite confident. That's why he's getting public support. So some people say, oh, that's why he's populist, not a pragmatist. But anyhow, he is trying to manage the policy to reflect the people's understanding and people's demand and people's interest rather than the 386 generation. That's why he actually drastically departed, especially in his policy to the alliance and also especially with Japan. Otherwise, if he follows 386 generation, he must be an anti-Japanese, pro-Chinese, and pro-Korean, pro-North Korean. But at the moment, he's a pro-Japanese, pro-alliance, relatively neutral to the, I do not say anti-China, but actually neutral to China, not friendly to China, very much. So I think that's my understanding of current things. I'm a little bit more optimistic. He underscored alliance as a backbone of our foreign policy and national security. That was not mentioned, I think, by the previous, like Moon Jae-in, No Mu-hyun, really emphasizing our self-reliant. We have to be a what they call balance so in Northeast Asia or more less dependent on great powers like that. Yeah. But Lee Jae-myung have not said anything like that.
No, Mark Carney's speech at Davos, the Canadian Prime Minister,
yes,
sounds a lot like the Korean, argument to like No Mu-hyun 20 years ago. Korea will be a balancer, and a middle power, and it sounds a little bit like Japan's arguments, in the 90s about an equidistant triangle between the U.S. and China and all this other stuff. The Canadian Prime Minister's echoing a bit of that. You can't blame him. Trump has been pretty mean to him and to Canada. But you don't really, in my view, hear that in Korea or Japan or Australia. The views of the U.S. were more positive than I would have guessed. Yeah, the views of Trump are negative, and this was taken before the Iran war, before he criticized the Pope, right? So even then, it was barely above Xi Jinping with a 2.91 out of 10 favorability. But the U.S. as a country had a 5.9 out of 10, which isn't
Yes.
terrible right now. I think in Europe, you'd get a lower number for sure. And when asked whether choosing the US or China, 71.4% said the US and only 10.8% said China. Pretty big gap. You compare that to the Southeast Asia ICS Institute poll, which I just
Yes.
featured, and that's more 50-50. So it's pretty clear where Korea stands. But here's the most striking thing of all. 97% of Koreans in your poll support the alliance, the US-RK alliance. And I wanted to ask you, what is the margin of error in your survey? Because if it's a 3% margin of error, then theoretically 100% of the Koreans
Yes, 3%.
support the alliance.
Yes.
You and I know Koreans who don't support the alliance, so it can't be true. But what is the margin of error? Is it about 2.5, 3% in the poll?
3%.
3%. So theoretically, 100% of Koreans.
100%. Yes, that's right. Yes.
This is not when I was in the White House in 2002 and Koreans were
Quite different.
protesting and because of the death of two schoolgirls and high school kids were singing F the USA in Korea. This was not the future any of us would have predicted down the road.
Mike, take a look at compare the current situation to the period you mentioned.
Yeah.
I don't see any anti-American protest in Seoul, in anywhere in Korea.
Yeah.
Even though there's for example, when President Trump announced excessive amount of tariff on Korea and asked Korea to invest in the U.S. So, but there has been no anti-American protest in Korea. I was wondering why. Because it's one factor contributing to the absence of anti-American protest is because President Lee Jae-myung. They believe, oh yeah, we have President Lee Jae-myung, he will handle all those things. We don't need to take a street. That's very interesting points. So that's one thing. And also why we have the support of 100% is like, okay, why 100% people support the ROK-US alliance? First, I think there's a growing concern about North Korean threat. They used to believe it's more image, kind of hypothetical, but now it's more real. That's one. Second, it's a China factor. Chinese coercive economic, political, and military actions actually made South Korean people aware of growing the threat coming from Chinese side. So the North Korean factor, constant but actually growing number of nuclear weapons. And also secondly, when South Koreans found that there was 14,000 North Korean soldiers fighting in the Ukraine war, they said, oh, it's a real. North Korea can use their conventional force vis-a-vis South Korea in any time. So it became more concerned with what I call this more complex provocation model of North Korea toward the South Korea. And China is there. And so that's why the people have become much more concerned with maintenance of ROK-US alliance. You mentioned that the Trump actually is below very low record of favorability. That happened when during the first term of Trump administration. But it lasted 4 years. Korean people know actually Trump administration will last 4 years, but US will last, I don't know how long, maybe it's 250 years anniversary this year, but another 250 years with us. And US is only the country doesn't have any territorial problem with us. And US is backing up in almost every dimension from military to economy and diplomatic, of course. But what I can say is maybe the Trumpism is perceived as a temporary, not permanent. That's why.
That's a really, really important point and a differentiator with our European allies. Because in Japan as well, in the government polls earlier this year, 93% of Japanese support the US-Japan alliance. And that's an increase from 89% 2 years ago. Trust in the US and under Trump is only 22% in some polls. But what that says to me is that Koreans, Japanese can differentiate between Trumpism and the US. I think in Europe, that's harder.
Yes.
I think the European perspective is that this is the US.
Yeah.
Even after Trump, this is the US. Personally, I think our Japanese and Korean allies have it right, but I understand why the Europeans are in a different place because they are receiving a much more negative set of messages from President Trump, Vice President Vance.
The Greenland case.
Oh, Greenland and Viktor Orban, you name it.
Yeah, Viktor Orban, yes.
Let's talk a little more about the US. We don't want to be Icarus. We don't want to fly into the sun with confidence and then crash. Things could go wrong. One of the shoes that did not drop. Our friend Victor Cha warned, and he wasn't the only one, that a second Trump administration might try to pull the Mechanized Infantry Brigade or even all of U.S. forces out of Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in part because of the Undersecretary of Defense Bridge Colby's earlier writings, thinking about we got to shrink the army to deal with China and Taiwan. That's an air and naval threat. Part of it was a worry that Trump would go for a peace treaty with North Korea and give away USK. But as far as I can see, that has not happened. There's no indication that will happen. If it did, I assume that would have a pretty big impact, though, on these numbers. What are you thinking about that?
I agree, because actually, initially, Korean people were concerned about the possibility of withdrawal of U.S. forces and hollowing out the ROK-U.S. defense treaty and alliance, more unilateral way, and transactional approach toward Korea. Actually, transactional approach only happened in trade and economy, not in the security field at all. We have maintained same level of forces all the way up now, or except some withdrawal of the Patriot missile and SAD because of the Middle East crisis. But that's not the first case. Actually, in the previous case, whenever there's necessity for the U.S. to relocate temporarily some forces, it happened all the way. But there's no systemic withdrawal or reduction of forces like, for example, during the Carter administration or during the Nixon administration. Nothing's happened. Of course, when Colby mentioned about, we will focus more on China, you will take care of the North Korean threat primarily. But that's only in words. Of course, we have to wait and see what will really happen. We are working together at the moment to collaborate toward a smooth transition from the current and to future strategy and roles and missions. But at the moment, we have to think about what are the critical nature of challenges we have and we will have into the future. Then we have to think about modifying or redefining the roles and missions of USFK. But that's not happened. But actually, I really appreciate Commander Brunson's speech with the press speech. Like when you look at from the upside down from this map, actually, the USFK is in the center of a strategic location in East Asia. So actually, there's still the person who was very supportive toward the ROK-US alliance. That's one thing. The other thing is the Korean people or the officials understand we need to modernize. The definition of modernization has not been clearly set out, but anyhow, we need to update as we experienced it during the early 2000 when Secretary Rumsfeld came to Korea. We need to think about new future. At the point of time, the key was a revolution in military affairs and more brigade style, more lightweight, rather than at the full-time station, the forces like we have at the moment. But actually, we have to think about it. So that raised a concern about dispute over maybe the discussion about the strategic flexibility of U.S. forces in Korea. But actually, it is necessary to think about it because with the changing characters of security environment, with the rise of Chinese coercive and expansive foreign policy and military actions toward its neighbors.
For people who don't know, the strategic flexibility is the idea that U.S. forces stationed in Korea, which are there primarily to deter or defeat North Korea, the idea that they could be used for other things like Taiwan contingencies.
Taiwan, yes.
But especially Taiwan. And so when I was in the White House, and at the time KNDA or somewhere,
yes, at the point I was in KNDA.
Yeah, in the diplomatic academy. But Secretary Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, unilaterally, without really running it through the NSC or State Department, pushed for strategic flexibility.
Yes.
And it went all the way to President Roh Moo-hyun, who in his summit in Washington, over breakfast, took it directly to President Bush and said, this is asking an awful lot of us. And President Bush agreed with him. He said, we shouldn't be putting you in that position. And I think he recognized that the U.S. approach had been a bit clumsy. I remember it because I was the note taker for their meeting, and we had a breakfast in the White House, and it was a Texas breakfast of steak and eggs. It was one of the most delicious breakfasts I've ever had. And if you've ever been a note taker, you're not supposed to really be eating. You're supposed to be taking notes, but it was so darn delicious.
Actually, I was in the same position when I was in NSC. I was note taker. So I know you.
I managed to eat most of the steak and eggs and take careful notes, just for the record. But now strategic flexibility has a bit more currency in Korea. People are not as allergic to the idea, it seems. So it does seem there is a more open attitude in Korea towards strategic flexibility. And to me, I think this has been a very important transformation in the strategic perspective of
Mhm.
Korean people, but also Korean, elite thought leaders like yourself. I remember when Park Geun-hye was president and her foreign minister put out their first statement on foreign policy. They said that the key partners are China and the US, followed by Russia, Japan, and others. And it struck me that the sort of default Korean view, probably not you, but for many was there are great powers like the US and China, and then there's a bunch of middle powers. And the key thing is to navigate between the US and China carefully. That's not where Japan was at the time under Abe. Abe
Yeah, that's
looked at
right.
Asia and saw multipolarity and said Japan can harness that multipolarity with a much stronger relationship with Australia, India, and so forth. He didn't include Korea for various reasons, which was unfortunate. But it seems to me that beginning with the previous president and now with Lee Jae-myung, there's a consistent move towards Korean strategic thinking, not of Korea as a sort of middle power, Thucydides' line, the strong will do what they do, the weak will suffer what they must, but actually a power that has agency and has influence because of partnerships beyond the Korean Peninsula with Japan, as we discussed, but especially with Australia now. With Europe, Korea has been an enthusiastic supporter of the IP4, the NATO, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand partnership. And the Indo-Pacific strategy, previous government was a bit incomplete. Moon Jae-in had his
New Southern policy.
Basically, it was a unilateral policy with a bit of cooperation with the US towards Southeast Asia. There wasn't any effort to really build it around Japan or Australia or India. That seems to have changed quite dramatically with the previous government, but maybe more so with Lee Jae-myung's government, and I wonder how much of it could also be, it's not just China, but it's that the global security situation has changed. The Koreans, more than anyone, except maybe Ukrainians, can see the China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, the Crinks axis. And what's your take on that? I think there is something very serious and important happening in Korean strategic thinking.
I think so, because actually nowadays, unfortunately, the term middle power is not common at the moment in Korea.
Good. I hate that term.
Yeah.
It's so passive.
On the other hand, actually, South Korean, strategic thinkers or government officials have found the necessity to diversify their partnership, strengthening their partnership with Japan, Australia, New Zealand, as well as the European countries. So that's a different story. But actually, my boss, Dr. M.J. Jung, nowadays, he's very much supportive to Asian NATO. Spoke-to-spoke collaboration, cooperation is much more important to navigate in this turbulent world. That is also shared by Prime Minister Ishiba as well. So I think that's a good idea. But actually, Korea has discovered its place in the world. Of course, but GPS, global pivotal state, that term is also gone because that term was previous administration's term. But Lee Jae-myung's administration has not come up with a new term yet. I was told that someone actually they are working on this midterm foreign policy strategy at the moment. We will see the release of that maybe in a couple of months. But actually, they're working very hard on that and working toward that direction, as well as the global South issue will be included in that new strategy. I hope so. Unfortunately, I have not been consulted by the government at all. Whether that's a good sign or bad sign, we see administration policy is not a big departure from the previous administration. Yeah. There's a lot of continuity in this administration as well. I will expect some good result out of this foreign policy. And also, other issue, actually, this is one that South Korea's perception of China. You mentioned about that during the Nominal era, like, we have the balance between the two great powers and good relations with China. That was in the very romantic 25 years of bilateral relations with China. But that period is completely gone. So not only economic issue, but also the territory. Actually, this is the violation of fishery agreement, what is a provisional measures zone constantly violated by Chinese fishermen, despite all the Chinese officials' promises. But that actually provoked the Koreans. But mostly about this, Xi Jinping's President Xi Jinping's attitude toward the Korea is not very much supportive toward, even under this administration, whether they support denuclearization of North Korea, whether they support the engagement. Of course, it always support, but what about this Iranian case? What is the Chinese potential? That actually some concerns of what is a real China. But actually, under the Xi Jinping leadership, China is quite different to one under the Jiang Zemin or the other previous Hu Jintao. So we have totally different China under the Xi Jinping administration.
The biggest advocate of an Asian NATO when the European NATO was formed was Lee Syngman,
Yes.
Korean president. He wanted collective security. And as Victor Shaw, our friend, wrote in his book, that scared the Americans and the Japanese and the Australians because they didn't want to create a collective security organization that Seoul could use to fight China and Russia and reunify the peninsula. Now it's back in vogue. I assume that NJ's view is not widely shared in Korea yet about an Asian NATO?
But not yet. It has emerged actually last year, early last year. It's less than a year-old idea. Of course, it's been circulating around, but public discussion has not been well staged. But it is an early stage of investigating the possibility and necessity. But anyway, the one common understanding about strategic thinkers, we need to additional strategic framework in addition to the bilateral relation with the United States, whether it's going to be trilateral or the Quad Plus or something else. But the reason why the MJ is supportive toward the Asian NATO, of course, is collective burden, not only collective security, but also collective burden sharing, collective responsibility to preserve peace and stability in East Asia, or in Asia as well. And also he suggested Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines as a starting member. Maybe we can start with some confidence building measures or some technical issues. Then we can build up from there.
It's interesting. In our surveys at the U.S. Study Center late last year, we asked the Quad countries, publics in the Quad countries, U.S., Japan, Australia, India, would you support making the quadrilateral framework of meetings and cooperation, would you support making the Quad a formal military alliance? And about half of the public in all four countries, including India, said yes. So the idea that there's a need for collective security is clearly growing in a lot of democracies in Asia. Of course, the Article 5 collective commitment to collective defense, that's a very high bar.
Yes.
But it does create a political permission structure for countries, governments like Korea's or Australia's, to do more together to invest in security collectively. And Korea's not done that much collectively. Korea, for example, has provided patrol boats to Vietnam and maritime domain awareness technology.
Only purely bilateral.
Usually bilateral and often just commercial. And the interesting thing will be how much now does the Korean government join the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and others in infrastructure financing, countering foreign interference. There's a lot of very active work done in Southeast Asia, the Pacific, South Asia, to prevent China from establishing dual-use ports. And Korea's been a little careful about that. So given these changes in strategic thinking, it will be interesting to see on the ground and see how much the Lee Jae-myung government wants to go down that path. Not of collective Article 5 defense, but actual collective action.
I think so. I think I'm positive.
Yeah.
There is going to be more collective action. Of course, for example, Lee Jae-myung has taken part in this summit for the State of Hormuz, preserving as hosted by Great Britain and France. So, and also second, and also actually, for example, this time Lee Jae-myung administration joined as a co-sponsor of the North Korean human rights bill in the UN. So it's kind of more collective actions oriented toward that. That's why I said Lee Jae-myung is much more practical rather than.
Can I just say a progressive Korean government supporting the human rights resolution in the UN is really unprecedented.
Yeah, actually, during the 5 years of Moon Jae-in administration, they did not sponsor.
Yeah,
they did not sponsor the North Korean human rights resolution in UN. But this time, actually, they co-sponsor.
Yeah,
that means they will vote yes.
Kim Dae-jung, when he was president, had a very heartfelt and candid discussion with President Bush about this and explained that he believed in human rights, but confronting North Korea would be counterproductive. That was the typical view on the progressive left in Korea.
You mean that the worst summit between Kim Dae-jung and Bush?
There were two summits. There was one when I was there that was bad, and then they went off on their own and had a good summit without the staff. Last question for me, and this is a big one. Your survey, again, showed very high support in Korea for an indigenous nuclear capability for South Korea, 80%.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. And a lot of governments and experts point to that and warn that proliferation in Northeast Asia is possible. What's your take on that? Is it kind of, I don't know, aspirational, or do you think people really quite seriously feel that Korea needs to develop its own nuclear deterrent?
I think, Mike, you correctly pointed out it's more aspirational and a national prestige.
Yeah.
Because actually, if we ask, are you eager to pay the cost of becoming indigenous nuclear power, or economic sanctions, or all this reputational damage? Are you ready to take all those things together? The response will drop maybe below 30%, around 30%.
Yeah.
At least. So actually, but I was wondering, why do they think they once have an indigenous nuclear capability or nuclear weapons, they say? It's kind of more prestige.
Because North Korea has it and Japan doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Well,
yeah.
Actually, they are usually compared to Japan has the right to reprocess and enrich, but why not South Korea? Why there's a discrimination against South Korea? So that kinds of things is one factor. Second, so actually, nowadays, maybe some politicians, they used to talk about indigenous nuclear armament. But nowadays they say, we need to have a nuclear latency rather than nuclear arms. So they say, I said, what's the difference between latency and nuclear armament?
So that would be like Japan with a full fuel cycle, with plutonium reprocessing, with a space and guidance capabilities and all the bits and pieces. Yeah.
So of course, there's actually the other factor, as we said, because the growing the threat of those kind of nuclear weapons. And second factor, of course, whether we can believe in the credibility of U.S. extend deterrence vis-a-vis South Korea. If I take a look at this, especially the Ukraine case, whether U.S. will fully commit, we say U.S. Ukraine is not a NATO member or the U.S. ally at all. It's quite different case. But on the other hand, whether this was a case about Taiwan, President Trump said, why we have to protect Taiwan in case of the Chinese invasion. So actually, was that true? I was wondering. But we have 28,500 U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula, and also the both countries are committed to each other. And on the other hand, South Korea, to make the U.S. people much more supportive toward the ROK peace and stability, we need to think about how we can reciprocate the U.S. commitment to the defense of South Korea at the regional level. To a certain degree, for that reason, I think we need to think of what kinds of roles and contribution we can make if there is any contingency in the region, not on the Korean Peninsula, and also how these two, for example, Taiwan Strait issue, in Korea, it's kind of taboo. We talk about Taiwan Strait issue, what kinds of roles. But actually, inside the government, there must be some discussion going, what kinds of things we can do together. Of course, that's related to the strategic flexibility of U.S. forces in Korea. But that's one thing. But what kinds of contribution and responsibility South Korea can make? For example, in case of Strait of Hormuz, it's all common issue, the global common issue. So it's a Taiwan Strait issue, or it's also a regional issue affecting not only South Korea, but all the other countries in the region. So we have to think about, there's a growing number of persons. We have to think about this. I think a couple of weeks ago, Chairman Lee Yong-jun, the Sejong Institute, he argued for, of course, I argued for my article in Chosilbo said, Taiwan contingency and Korean contingency is one thing, interconnected each other. So we have to think about, it's one theater.
Was that a provocative piece, or did people who read it agree with you, do you think?
Of course, reply on that. Actually, I agree. I support, but don't expect anything from the Ijeong administration, that kind of thing. But actually, I think that we have to think about it. Growing number of people are arguing for that. But actually, on the other hand, redeployment tactical nuclear weapons is also the support for that is growing. I was very surprised. Someone who used to be a not much supportive toward the redeployment. Nowadays, they say, oh, we need to think about the redeployment tactical nuclear weapon.
Of U.S. tactical.
Yeah, tactical. It is not violation of the NPT, but still U.S. has possessed the sole authority. U.S. president has the sole authority over the nuclear weapons. So, of course, how we can endure or respond to possible Chinese coercion vis-a-vis South Korea, as in the case of THAAD 2017. So Chinese economic coercion is expected. But unlike 2017, nowadays we can think about collective response toward the Chinese economic coercion, as Victor mentioned.
Yes. And that's economic security is a whole nother area where Korea can be a thought leader and has significant technology and experience. We could do 3 shows or 10 shows on the strategic direction of the Republic of Korea. And my show is called The Asia Chessboard. But on the chessboard, Korea is a very, very important piece, not just because of the peninsula. And you gave a real insight into that. So Dr. Choi Kang from Asan, thank you very, very much.
I really enjoyed it. I appreciate for the invitation. I hope there will be another chance to be with you.
Yeah, we'll need to, because we barely scratched the surface. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
For more on strategy and the Asia program's work, visit the CSIS website at csis.org and click on the Asia program page. And for more on the U.S. Studies Center in Sydney, please visit ussc.edu.au.